Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Doody, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune in to Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. M. Stoner, Inc. and the Council for Advancement and Supportive Education, CASE, are conducting a survey of how schools, colleges, and universities use various digital tools and techniques in alumni relations, communications, fundraising, and marketing. We invite you to participate. Results will help you benchmark your institution's digital advancement initiatives and track trends related to the use of digital tools in educational advancement. The survey should take about 20 minutes to complete. Respondents who complete the survey and supply their email address will receive a complimentary copy of the survey findings and be entered to win access to M. Stoner's on-demand course, Digital Storytelling for Higher Education. This broadcast is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover additional personal and professional learning opportunities. I want to take a moment to thank Kate Zulu, who is helping to monitor the back channel and forwarding to me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. So on to our content here. We're going to start off by asking everyone to briefly describe your current role and background in digital research and digital communities. Let's start with you, Paul.
All right, my name's Paul Eaton. I'm an assistant professor of higher education administration at Sam Houston State University near Houston, Texas. And my background is that I did my dissertation research on how college students experience their digital identity and subjectivity across multiple social media platforms. So I finished that research 3 years ago and then moved into this role as an assistant professor. And for the last couple of years, I have been working on a really large study that has many facets with Laura and Josie and Adam and some other folks called the Networked Communities of Practice Study, where we're looking at a lot of different questions around how professionals in higher education experience digital spaces and how they use them for professional learning and development. I also am engaged in some research around online learning and how do we engage effective pedagogical practices in online spaces for students. So that's because I teach in an online program now, and so I'm also interested in those types of issues.
Excellent. All right, Laura, you're up next.
You caught me when I was tweeting. Thanks, Tony. Awesome. Laura Pasquini. I'm a senior lecturer at the College of Information at the University of North Texas. I work in the Learning Technologies Department and study how we work and learn in a digital age, and what that means for sharing knowledge, sharing practice, sharing evidence as network practitioners and network scholars. I'm also a researcher at the Digital Learning Social Media Research Lab at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. That appointment is ongoing, and I work with George Velichanos, a great researcher and the chair of Canada's Learning Technologies. So I am looking forward to sharing a little bit about what we've been working on over the last few years. And I'm not going to talk about my dissertation because that seems so long ago, but I'm really hoping to dialogue and learn from my peers, what they're studying, and share with all you what we've been learning so far in the last couple of years of our research and exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right, Josie, you're up next.
Hello, my name is Josie Ahlquist. I am streaming in from Los Angeles, but I also work with Florida State University. I teach and research online. And I got into researching this because I am just so darn curious about explaining behavior and pointing out opportunities, because if it wasn't for social media, I wouldn't be where I am today, especially knowing all these amazing colleagues that I get to research with. So it started with exploring how senior leaders were highly active on Twitter. And there weren't a lot back when I was starting to research this. And now that's exploded to college presidents and more vice presidents about how they're interacting and really being able to impact using social media tools. And then the other slice of my research agenda is looking at college students and how they're showing up online, especially those that serve in student leadership positions. And that's where the branches of what I do as a speaker, when I go out to speak to students, I'm trying to help empower them and find their purpose in their use of these tools. So being able to research this, specifically network communities opportunities, has been able to connect all those different components of what I research into one little package.
Thank you. All right, Adam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Gismondi. Thanks, Tony, for having us on today. I work at the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, which is at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, so just north of Boston. I do my work here. I do qualitative research. I do research to practice and communications work. And I'm also a part-time faculty member down at Boston University's higher ed grad program. My background on this issue, I also did my dissertation on in the social media realm, which is how I got connected with these good friends of mine. My topic looked at how college student use of social media was impacting their civic learning and civic engagement. So this project kind of fits in one square of that, and my work here in this office is another piece of that.
Great. So Paul, you decided to study the Student Affairs Facebook Professionals group. Why did you think this group in particular was important to this study?
Okay, so like I said in my original comments, we're conducting a really large study about how higher education professionals in a variety of arenas are using different social media networks and platforms to build digital communities of practice, basically. So this study that we've been engaged in for the last couple of years, we've interviewed close to 100 professionals. We've been able to talk to folks about how they're using Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of these different spaces. But one of the things that kept coming up in our research was around this group, the Student Affairs Professionals Facebook group. And of course, we know Facebook is one platform that has certain types of affordances that allow you to do things like create closed groups or create pages. So we became interested in how people were experiencing this space. And what we wanted to know was what is actually going on in this space. Because there's not, people experience social media in different types of ways, and that can be influenced by a variety of factors, from who they are as people to the way that social media platforms set up algorithms and things of this nature. But we really didn't have a good sense of what was actually occurring in the space. This is one of the largest spaces. There is almost 30,000 people as a part of this group. It tends to be a very active space. And so what we wanted to really do was to better understand what's going on in the space, what are people sharing, what are they talking about, how are they experiencing it. And so that was one of the reasons we decided it would be important for us to think about and start asking those questions in some pretty digitally methodological ways, right? Not just anecdotally, but actually looking at the data, analyzing it, and seeing what's going on.
So Laura, can you talk about how you collected the data that you analyzed?
Yeah, I worked with actually Abdul Abad. Is a doctoral student who works at Columbia University and a community college locally in New York City, and he and I worked to pull the data from the group, because the Facebook community, it being one of the largest scaled communities on Facebook, it was open and accessible to extract that data. And we used a process, and I'll share a link to kind of where we borrowed from. It was actually a content or marketing person that figured out how do you best take data from the group to analyze it, because unlike pages where you have insights or analytics on Facebook that they offer. There's no one easy way to do it. If it's an open group, you can see a quick snapshot, but we really want to look at, to answer the question is, what do they really talk about over a 14-month period of time? So to best answer that question, we started looking at the group, because this started back in 2009 by a professional. It was kind of handed over to the Essay Collective. It's loosely moderated by a group of volunteers, and that group of volunteers said, we don't really know. We have an idea of what's being talked about, but we don't really know what's going on. And as we were all members of the group, I thought an ethnographic approach, it's an anthropology approach, to look at this group would be the most suitable. And sometimes you call it an ethnography, but it's really figuring out a few different ways to look at the group. It's one of the ways is to look at the content of the posts, similar to like looking at discussion boards back in the day, or IRC. They looked at different kind of coding communities. This is the same idea as looking at the posts, the comments, the threads, the interactions, and the sentiments that are in there that come out of those interactions. So from 2016 onward, our decision was to study that group, because that's when Facebook reactions came in. So the little heart, happy face, wow face, all that came in, and we saw some more interactions on certain posts based on those reactions, and also based on people commenting or liking or putting images within threads. So what we decided to do, Abdul and I scraped and kind of cleaned up the data for the 14-month period from 2016 till about March 2017, because that's when the group was last open and the data and content was accessible. So that's what we did, is set up the data to look at and have an understanding of, well, what's actually been going on, and not just have these anecdotes, but let's look at what actual conversations are happening, what are the most popular kind of conversations, and why do people really go to this group, and what's their purpose?
Just to give everyone a foundation here, can someone talk to the differences, the distinction between a fan page and a group, what the benefits and challenges might be?
Well, we spoke with the administrators. So at the time, there was about 3 or 4 active administrators, and they said they really just didn't know, and they weren't getting feedback from the group itself of why it's being used or how they want to see it being used. And this is one of the many communities we're looking at. So there's a bunch of other different Facebook groups, Twitter chats and communities on hashtags, just other spaces that people are using as communities. And so we asked, like, what would be most beneficial? And they said, we've always been trying to figure out, well, what do they want to talk about? What do they talk about? And have a starting page. So in our communication with some of the administrators, we asked, would it be most helpful, because they can't, other than using a tool like Sociograph, they can't really get a full picture of what the data looks at for themselves, and to look at it and make decisions on what is being talked about, or what kind of piques the interest of the group, because the algorithms are really changing a lot of that. And so Nick Sierniak, he has a book on platform capitalism. He talks a little bit about how that knowledge is information when you're sharing on these platforms, but some of the ways these platforms function are making decisions of what you see, when you see, how you see it, depending on where you sit and where you're situated in that network. So I think that's really what we want to do, is scrape that raw data and figure out for ourselves without any biases or misconceptions of what we think it is, and find out what really is going on and what they're talking about.
And I think the other thing to your question, Tony, is that like a group is something that can be controlled more than a page, right? So if you have a fan, if you have a, oh, it's the opposite?
Yeah, so groups have, like, users can post things and they can do what they want. And so it's not moderated by a page keeper or manager. So.
But you can also like close a group, right? Which is what happened with the Facebook group. So the Facebook group used to be open, where like anyone could sort of join, freestyle. Now the Student Affairs Professionals group is a closed group where somebody has to actually...
No, they always had to be moderated in. I think the difference is anyone can post if you're a member of that group, versus on a page, it gets kind of pushed to this side little compartment. It may not be a mainstream. It's not like a push out marketing, like I call it a promotion thing. It's usually led discussion from a community, like old school discussion boards, except this discussion board is really messy, ugly, and people don't really know what's going on.
Yeah.
And if someone is not really well versed in this, in the weeds of this, that's why most brands you'll see have a Facebook page And then if it's more of like a discussion forum, it'll take place in a Facebook group. So.
That's a good distinction. Okay.
And so I'll say some examples of communities that have used Facebook groups that we found, because we read a lot of literature. Thanks, team. So things like after hurricanes or tornadoes go through, communities aggregate together, create a group so they can have discussions, interactions. We've seen it for protests. We've seen it for mothers of a certain kind. We see it for HIV and AIDS groups. So like there's different reasons why groups form for activism, political groups, school learning communities. So groups happen because they can be more, I guess, organic and led by the community and led by the group is the big feature.
So Adam, there's been a lot of talk about privacy issues related to Facebook and other social media lately. How did you, in your study, protect people's privacy, and why is this important for researchers doing social media research?
Yeah, so yes, it has been in the news a lot. You may have gotten inundated with emails from the fallout of the GDPR in Europe. But as far as our study goes, so as Laura mentioned, what we did was we pulled data when it was public. So the group was open, and the kind of stretch of data that we pulled from was from this being an open group that was searchable by anybody, and you didn't require special permission to access. So that was kind of our starting point. But in terms of the data, once we pulled it and we were working with it, we used a system that was login protected, just shared among the researchers. And the posts that we looked at, the way that we did this, it was all anonymized. So posts weren't tied necessarily to one user. It was all, they were assigned random numbers and like letter number strings. So we were looking at the content of the posts and the engagement of the posts and some of the categories that Laura mentioned. So things like, what was the sentiment around the conversation? Were people using GIFs to communicate back and forth? Were they using emojis? And then we worked in different ways of categorizing by theme, but it wasn't like we were saying like this user is the most popular of the group. Right? It was none of that. So for the purposes of this project, this was users were anonymized, like I said, but all the data that we pulled was publicly available.
So Laura, what kind of analysis, what types of analysis did you conduct, and why were these the approaches you decided to employ?
So in thinking about the conversations that probably brought this more to the interest table, now Facebook, as we know with Cambridge Analytica and questions about the data around Facebook, Adam said it right. We were very cautious to make sure that any of this information was kept anonymous and was really about the content of the post. So analyses using qualitative methods, typically looking at posts, we had 4 different kind of a set and pieces of this data set. So we didn't look at all, I think there was like 13,000 some odd posts. We looked at a smaller sample set. It was about about 10% of the posts to get an idea of what was conversed about in the 14 months. And so each qualitative looked at by doing open Excel coding on like codes and just ideas of what each sentiment went on. So one thread I can remember had an initial post and had maybe 700 comments. So we'd open up all the comments and code the entire thread to know like what were they talking about? What was kind of the emotion that was going around, whether it was positive, frustration, anger, interest, questions. And we really wanted to get a feel for, because you can't just go ahead and like put in and mine it with a tool without having an understanding of semantics. So like things like images came up, GIFs, video responses, and there's a lot of resource sharing. So there's no way that a text miner would find like what a URL to a grad program was, or sharing of a resource for a residential training program. So we'd have to go through and read and code, and we had each of us kind of double code a few of them that were longer, and just to make sure we had the right sentiments. So those codes were kind of grouped together into themes, and I think it was really interesting to read and see the discourse and see, honestly, threads sometimes went on for like 30 days. Some went on, usually 2 to 3 days is normal, but some conversation threads went on just based on different interests and what people want to talk about.
And if you've ever been on this group, which you probably are if you're listening to this Higher Ed Live episode, there are definitely some posts that go on for thousands of comments. And so we went through all of those.
Wow. You all love coding, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I love coding, but I love reading the full stream of 1,000 threads. You know, it's very interesting.
So Josie, how are professionals using the space? What did you learn based on your analysis?
Yeah, I think all of us joined for a variety of different reasons. What I love to see is this part of the study where we start to make the connections and the light bulb and aha moments. What drew me to be part of this study was because of my consulting and speaking work, I have so many individuals that ask me, where should I be active online, or asking me advice about this specific group, both having positive and negative experiences, or just they ask me, what's your opinion of this Facebook group? So I also wanted to feel like I was not just had some thought about it, but I could actually give them data and knowledge. So this is really powerful, because I think if you ask a variety of different people, they're going to have very different answers in their perception of what the group is. Either I had a very bad, or even they might call it harmful experience and they're not in it anymore, or they go on there every single day and it validates their experiences and they find resources constantly. So a lot of the research that Paul and Laura are doing in more qualitative ways, I think is really going to bring that out. But I guess what I would say overarchingly is we were pleasantly surprised. And as far as what we found, what was actually going on in this group, and there were 10 themes that I'm just going to quickly touch upon about, well, what's the content types? What are individuals sharing, seeking resources on, and the types of, again, like interactions that are going on. So the very first one is we are talking about students. No surprise, student affairs professionals. We want to give students support, resources, programming, planning for success, what our role is with students. That's being talked about a ton. Community, overarchingly. So an individual will post a question like, oh, I'm moving to California in Los Angeles. What's the best area of town to live in? Or group involvement, asking people, are you going to NASPA next month? Different types of engagement posts that's calling community members to interact. The third theme what we found was actually more of positive emotions, a motivational message like a quote or an image, inspirational quote, perspective taking, even if it's maybe something that a challenging situation someone's trying to overcome. The next one that was pretty obvious was jobs. And of course, we can't sort the data based upon demographics, if they're early professionals or senior level, but a lot of these jobs were like those entry to mid-level roles in searching, recruiting, interview tactics and tips. Hey, can somebody look at my resume? The process for job application. So a lot of talking about that. The fifth one was asking for advice, asking questions, problem solving, feedback, soliciting thoughts. So again, individuals putting out questions out to the group. The next finding was about resources. So sharing best practices from, hey, I'm trying to create a new programming model or residential programming curriculum. We want to create new questions to ask new resident directors that we're interviewing, so we could really ask for those types of resources. The next big finding was support. Some of these do cross over. So maybe there's a campus issue, a campus crisis, some kind of current event, and especially during the time that we analyzed data, there were a lot of current events happening from the election to the inauguration and so on. Another one that, of course, I'm very appreciative of and is very much true of social media is humor. We like to laugh. We like to share funny videos and clips, and there were threads of share your puppy or your kitty that we can interact with our fur friends. Again, these might be quotes as well. And then the last two is personal stories. So maybe some big win they had on their campus, an interaction they had with a student or a parent that they really wanted to share. Some of that may also have been opinions, so having a strong stance on an issue that was going on. current news, recent events. And then the last one we labeled as professional. So maybe that was more about conferences, affiliations, memberships, competencies, and interpretations. So those were our big 10 themes and findings. And I think what we learned through this process, because many times where I get asked about, well, don't you see this other type of content that I keep seeing when I go to this group, is, and Laura might hit on this more clearly, is the way the algorithm works. The more attention a post gets, the higher up it's going to show up in a group. And so if you're popping in and commenting or interacting with a post that's, let's say, highly contested, that's the first thing that you're going to see. You're missing everything else that's going down in the group that you may never ever get to. So our research was able to see a big landscape and not just these big moments that maybe had more, I guess you could say, drama involved with those. Even though we did find that they happened, that was not the average post that we were finding.
I mean, that is such a powerful and valuable list of themes that you just went through. It makes me wonder, what did we do before social media to accomplish all of this, right?
Well, and another thing, this fits in with what communities of practice and professionals do. They obviously need this space to dialogue for different reasons, and it's become a go-to space for a number of people to get in, get access, get resources, and get exposed to, I think, the profession, which I think often gets overlooked. And even though it's not an open group, many people can join, and they're really willing to share. And I think that's the essence of the community that I think gets forgotten, because it doesn't always serve everyone the same way at the same time, but it does serve more people than we think, that we don't know. And that's kind of what we really found.
And one thing I'll just add is that as part of this process, I think it was mentioned earlier, but we went through hundreds of articles in our lit review, and it's really amazing when you look at how many other, I mean, because this is such a new area for research that we ended up kind of looking at who else is using this as a community of practice, like Facebook groups and social media. And so we looked at everything from, nursing to engineering to all these different areas, where sometimes we might think of it more as like a classroom thing or like within educational environments for students. This is something that we're kind of looking at the higher ed space of it, but I think it's really important on a more broad level, like Laura was getting at too, that it's a lot of fields that are leveraging these new platforms in this way.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul, which posts actually garnered the most engagement? And as you share that, what do you think that might say about our profession and the ways that professionals are using, a group like SAP?
Yeah, so there are 3 particular posts in our data set that had the most number of interactions. And this could be either shares, the most number of comments, or the most number of people liking, loving, ha-haing, whatever the case is. Those different types of reactions you can have on the Facebook group. So 2 of the posts have to do with Black Lives Matter. There was a post that was made. It's actually a picture of a campus, and it was the individual who posted it made the comment that their campus was making a statement today, and what the campus had done was posted a Black Lives Matter flag next to their university flag and the American flag. And so this post got a lot of attention. It got a lot of likes, it got a lot of reshares, and it got a lot of comments about the importance of engaging the Black Lives Matter discussion within our campus environments. And, that thread has a lot of discussion around how our campus is dealing with and addressing Black Lives Matter in their own spaces. How do you talk about that issue with students? How are administrators approaching the conversation of Black Lives Matter? Similarly, another post that had a lot of interactions was during the time of the Black SAP blackout. Folks may remember when members of the Black Student Affairs professional community decided to take over the space of the Student Affairs Facebook, or the Student Affairs Professionals Facebook group. They used the hashtag #BlackSAPBlackout. And this was around a time where members of that community were trying to educate folks in the Student Affairs Professionals community about the experiences of Black and other minority, racial and ethnic minority professionals in the field, and the way that white supremacy and white privilege plays out in our field. So that particular post and posts around that particular hashtag garnered some of the most attention, some of the most discussion, the most reposting. And then the third, and this is the one that actually had the most conversation. It was the conversation that went on the longest and also had the most dialogue in terms of the length of the thread, the number of comments. I think that there were, is it like 8,800 comments? So like 8,861 comments on this one thread. And the thread has to do it with, I'll just say, side hustles. Basically, the point of the original post had to do with, what are people doing to make extra money to be able to support themselves financially? Now, this is important because the thread, when you read through all 8,861 of those comments, brought up a lot of issues that professionals in the field are facing in terms of finances, right? It brought up conversations around the amount of student loan debt that student affairs professionals are carrying. It brought up conversations around interesting ways that people are making money on the side, everything from consulting to, getting a second job to taking on teaching responsibilities. And it also talked about the types of stress that student affairs professionals feel in terms of their finances. So for us as researchers, this is an example of where a community like this really allows us as a profession to sort of have gain awareness about something that maybe we don't really talk about a lot, but that clearly is an issue that the profession needs to deal with. In this case, we know that we're in a profession where people tend to start off, or over the course of their career, they don't make as much money in most cases. They're taking on large amounts of debt, and that creates certain types of stress and pressure. So people are coming to this community to talk about those types of issues and to resolve those types of crises. So those were the three most discussed and engaged posts in the group.
So Adam, what are some areas that you identified that we could use some additional research?
Sure. So to kind of start off with, so one thing that Paul was kind of getting at there, I think each of us at one point or another has written about this concept of, for college students, when we think about student development, that we need to think about the online as an extension of campus, that it's no longer okay to just think of what's happening on physical campus spaces. And we think about what is a student experience when they go back to their residence hall and log online and those sorts of things, and what kind of interactions are they having with people there. And I think part of what we're doing here is trying to look at practice in this way as well. So what is it like as a student affairs professional, not just in their, when they kind of enter the workspace and when they leave with a workspace, but what are the kind of pieces around it? And so I think there's a lot of questions there for future work, just as a starting point. But some other things that we identified, Laura mentioned a little bit about, and Josie, about the algorithm of Facebook, and I guess just generally, like, what are the ways in which Facebook's algorithm influences the individual user's experience with the space? So is it, how often are these things showing up? And then how is it impacting the user experience? I think that that's really important. It's also important really from the architecture of the application side. But as researchers, I think what we're concerned with largely is the student affairs professional side and kind of the professional development side of this generally. we've talked a little bit about the space being a place where people might feel that it's violent or disruptive engagement in the group. And we think that looking at the experiences of different professionals within the student affairs group is really an important next step to this. Thinking about issues of social identity, where someone is in their professional career, and maybe doing some case study work around that, I think might be important. Another piece that we talked about was why people might join or leave the group. And some of the decisions around that, because there are a lot of decisions there, and it's important actually to think about it from a group dynamic perspective, but also from a profession level, and then also from an individual level. So why might someone want to join the group? Why might they leave? Paul talked about one of the most popular posts, but things about employment and underemployment issues. So what is it like as a professional? You know, what are we thinking about in terms of issues of equity, career development, support? Something else that we're interested in is conversations around event-based moments, or something that occurs on a campus in society. And I think a couple of us have sort of dabbled in this. I did a piece with Laura Pasquini at Florida State that looked at some of the digital organizing from students around issues like Black Lives Matter, tuition protests in Canada a couple years ago. But how might like a singular event turn the page on some of these issues? And then the last piece that we identified as an area for additional research in this is the emotional work of the volunteers who moderate and are the admins in the group, and broadly in digital communities. So we've really attempted to be transparent and work with the admins of this group in particular. And I think we've all learned a lot about what does it mean to administer a group like this, and why is there turnover? And you see some of those conversations play out within the group itself. So there's lots of issues to explore, and that's probably just the start of them.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there and say, I also want to know what's the responsibility for our professional fields, organizations, and associations in this, because we're using a space that people think is quote unquote free, but it's not. We're giving our data. So these free spaces, we're letting them make decisions. So great researchers like Sophia Noble, who wrote the book Algorithms of Oppression, or Chris Gilliard, who talks about digital redlining. Things are happening in these digital spaces that are free, that aren't free, and they're biased, and they have technologies that come at us in a neutral way. So I would like to know more about like the profession and the field's responsibility for where these conversations could happen, because they want to happen. Could that be in a different organic space? Does it have to be led by an association, or could a community develop somewhere else? And those are kind of some spaces and pockets we're starting to see in other professional organizations. So like Caucus in Canada created dialogue spaces for their communities of practice that was specifically not on a social media platform that takes their data, but as private, has some spaces that's organized a bit better, and it taps in some of the frustrations that we have heard from this community itself. So I think I'd like to know a bit more about maybe the responsibilities as us as professionals, thinking about where we are and be, and where do we want to share our data and knowledge that in a space we don't own technically. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm also interested in these kinds of issues that have come up. Some people call it digital literacy, some people call it digital communication. But I think one of the interesting things is that, you know, again, these platforms did not exist, 14 years ago. They're, 14 or 15 years old, right? This is like such a new type of a thing, but they've so become a part of our ecology, our way of being in the world. And I'm really interested in how do people actually develop the skill set that they need, or the communication strategies that they need to be able to be active participants in these types of community spaces, right? Because I think that a lot of times what happens is people join these groups, they may be consuming a lot of information, but not necessarily producing a lot within the space, or they may drop in and out based on certain types of conversations that are going on. And so part of what happens is that we don't necessarily have really good ways to help people develop the kind of community-oriented practices that they need in order to be effective members of these types of spaces, right? Or how to manage conflict in the space, or how to not just, if the space is, you know, if someone says something and you don't agree with it, to not just like decide that you're going to turn your tail and run, right? And seclude yourself from the space, but how do you actually engage in a sort of dialogue? So these types of, you know, things have a lot to do with communication, literacy, and the platforms. So we also have to think about, you know, what makes people move through social media spaces differently, right? Why do I choose to be a part of Facebook, but not a part of Instagram? Or why do I participate in the Twitter stream, but don't be active in LinkedIn? So these kind of decision-making processes that people are having and how that occurs and changes, I think part of the reason it's really difficult to do that kind of research is because these, you know, platforms are proliferating and changing all the time, right? Like they start taking on characteristics of other platforms. They start, you know, people start leaving, or something happens like what happened with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica stuff. And all of a sudden everyone's like, I'm getting out of here. And now I'm going to start this space. So it makes it really hard because it's just, it's so fast now that by the time you do some of the research and publish your findings, it might be outdated, right? Like it's just very complicated because of how quickly it all moves.
And I think the importance of researching this topic and many others is to continue to validate it as a valid source for community, for knowledge, and knowing that this Facebook group may actually not just be a side pocket, but helps explain the profession in ways that we don't want to talk about. But like that major finding about the financial realities, like that is a reality, right? It's exposing things we need to talk about more within our field. We may not like it. It makes us uncomfortable, but it's bringing those things to the future and then seeing that as valid and not just saying, oh, it's a Facebook group or, oh, it's Twitter. I think as we continue to do this type of research, it brings important conversations to the table and continues to validate social media is not this one source. It's all the same. It's one and the same. It's not online or offline. It's us.
Mm-hmm.
I think, just sorry, Tony, one thing I'll throw in there is, and if there's any question of the fact that higher ed professionals are still grappling with these issues and haven't really arrived and may never, I mean, these things are just changing quickly. I mean, so you may remember an incident regarding Yik Yak a couple of years ago. Paul and I wrote a piece kind of processing what had happened a couple years ago, and now the platform's gone already. I mean, they're out of business. And so, but at the time, it was kind of a new thing for a lot of people. There was sort of an overreaction from the field. And I think one of the things that's nice about taking a moment to stop and myth bust and look at some of the things that we're seeing here is that hopefully we're looking at the actual, what's actually happening here, you know, instead of just making assumptions and then bringing that into practice. We're hoping to get everyone to pause and then look at the reality of the situation. So
speaking of Yik Yak, Josie, can you talk about some of the potential negative aspects as well as the positives of being a member of the digital community practice in general, not necessarily the Student Affairs Facebook group?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook groups are just one of the many out there, from Twitter, LinkedIn, blogging, podcasting, and maybe we'll hit on those towards the end. But I kind of equate it to living in Los Angeles and preparing to go on the 405. Like the view is going to be amazing. I'm probably going to get to where my destination is, but I am probably going to hit some traffic. And I'm just going to roll with it and know my skills as a driver to maneuver around it. And online is is the same. You may run into trolls on Twitter that are bots. In our Facebook group, somebody may have a really bad day and is triggered and reacts to your post. And when you ask them to dialogue back, they may completely ghost you. Like, unfortunately, the same terms that we would hopefully abide by face to face, people can kind of squirrel around through, and it can be hard not to take that personally. So we're still figuring out the terms and conditions of like the ethics and the ethic of care. And I think we all could do a lot better, because where I find people get heightened so quickly and where the negative starts to come out is when that back and forth starts to happen, when we start to make assumptions. We really do have to stay committed in the discomfort, just like we would tell our students to do the same when we're having difficult dialogues face to face. How can we start to teach those skills in digital platforms? Maybe that first step is, can we get this to a phone call? Like, that's where I love to see in threads, getting movement to actually to have interaction. So yeah, there's gonna be some negative. There might be some misunderstandings, but I also think there can be huge opportunities for growth, but you can't run away from it. You have to stay committed into it. So that's where I would put out the challenges. Why are you logging on? Why are you going to that Facebook group? Are you just jumping in to see what drama is happening that day, to egg on, or just to lurk and watch it as a voyeur? Or are you actually there to help problem solve and be a resource and be a mentor? Because if you go back to your own ethics and rationale for the field, it's probably not to just watch something go downhill, right? Like, how can you help? Or is it actually doing harm to yourself? So for your own choices, it is time for you to leave that group or not be part of that Twitter chat anymore. You have to take ownership for how you spend your time. Like, use your time in a values sense. So you really have to be more conscious of the choices that you are making, because all those things that happen in all of social media spaces, negative, can happen in our communities. But I think there's lots of ways we can, again, start to counteract that with applying ethics. I do think in many different practices, the power of moderators really need to be amplified. The challenge is the amount of time that takes. How do you even like compensate or support them, because they really can set the tone. And again, Paul mentioned earlier the emotional toil that it can take on a moderator, especially for 30,000 people. Like, literally, you're president of a very large university at that point. Like, yeah. And you probably have 2 other jobs, because most likely, you know, anyway. So anyway, that's a sidebar on some negative stuff. I'd love to talk about positive too.
So this question for all of you, before we wrap up here, what advice would you have for student affairs professionals who do choose to participate in these groups?
I feel like Laura should start.
Because you think I'm going to contradict someone. So I don't want to give advice because we're still figuring out things. And so I don't think us saying digital in front of the network has changed. I think network lives and network practice and our professions have been around for decades. It's just looked different. It's been a phone, it's been email, it's been a telegram, whatever that is. How we communicate and share knowledge is becoming more critical, and thinking about how we're being in these spaces are still really important. I think Josie said it is, what is your purpose for being in a space, or being online, or being connected might be one thing to consider. But I think we're still in early stages of inquiry and exploration. And I really want to study more the problems and the questions and not the things. So I think a good question, a future foreshadow for future research, and we've asked folks what would happen if this community were to go away in our interviews. And it's fascinating to hear the responses, and that's when the true intentions of why they're motivated to be online and be connected comes out. And I think the most often thing talked about has been the people and the community and why they went there in the first place, because someone was told them, they were invited, they felt welcome. So I think figuring out where that space is for you is really important. And maybe it's not always being in that space, and it's communities that are blended. So some of the best ones we've seen are hybrids. They're online, and digital, but they're also meet up at conferences. They also work on papers. They also work on projects together in different ways. And I think we're seeing more of that grow. And it's less a digital thing. I think we'll drop digital. We'll just talk about us as communities and practice.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on, we did get a question from John Sauter about managing these communities. And though I know it wasn't the purpose of your research, were you able to glean any best practices for how these moderators might go about overseeing, going through the art of moderation, particularly for some of the affinity groups and subcommittees that develop from the larger group?
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Josie.
I was just going to say, Facebook just released some new moderator tools that allow you to more clearly define group community guidelines, even though that is definitely a best practice that I would not wait to include. But you can actually now include bullet points of potentially, like let's say if someone was to report someone not abiding by one of those community rules, it can be more clearly connected. So anyway, I just want to throw that out.
And actually, Tony, like in our larger study, this is something that Laura and I have been asking, because we've talked to a lot of moderators of not just this group, but of chats like the AC Advise chat or the SA chat, some of these other communities,
podcasts,
blogging communities, all of these things that exist in these networked communities. So a couple of things, even though we haven't officially analyzed this data, some of the things that come up a lot are that you need to have some kind of distributed leadership structure, right? That there needs to be a way for that responsibility to not fall just on sort of one person or two people, because it is very time consuming. You need to be able to find a way to foster engaging members of the community in what the community is going to do. So it's not necessarily just the moderator's responsibility, for example, to decide that we are going to talk about this topic in the chat, or we're going to only allow these types of posts, but how do you make these spaces more democratic and community focused, right? So like, AC Advise chat is a good example of where they poll their members about what do you want to talk about? What are the issues? How do you, these types of things. And then, pull on the expertise of people in the community and try to build, I would say, like a leadership stream, right? So that maybe somebody comes in and they sort of, do a couple of guest hosting chats, or they might, guest moderate something or whatever, and then they move into the leadership structure. So it's really an important question that I think we need more research on, and we need to better understand it. But we are starting to understand at least that taking on the role of moderator is a lot of additional work for people that often goes uncompensated. And this is where I think Laura's comment from earlier about what is the role of professional associations in all of this. Do professional associations have to take on some of this responsibility? Do these have to be, I don't know what the answer to that question is. There are possibilities and limitations, but I think those are larger questions we need to start grappling with as a profession.
A couple easy ones, I could say tending to the garden. So some people have thought about in their communities having, so Facebook, if you're going to use that platform, they've created an event for a thread of career posts, as an example, to organize, because Facebook is just a hot mess in terms of its organization and how topics come up. So they've created events for career stuff, events for resource stuff, and some sharing groups. Other moderators of groups in Facebook think about themes on Wednesdays or Tuesdays. They have a prompt. So it's not just about like random people posting things. It's also starting that dialogue and rotating that dialogue. And so like Paul said, that leadership of sustainability, we've seen communities thrive for, at this point, up to almost 10 years, some of them. And so I think it's been pretty amazing to see them kind of point people or give ownership back to the community, and them being there at serving a purpose, whether it's responding to folks, moderating, asking questions, asking other people to join the community that could give senior advice or specialty advice has been really important for some of these groups.
So I want to give everyone an opportunity to get back to the question of what advice you'd have for student affairs professionals who want to participate in these groups. And I'd ask you to keep it to about a minute, no more than a minute, so we can get to our last question.
My advice would be that you should think very carefully about which spaces you want to be a part of, and that it's okay for you to go in and out of a space, but to make sure that if you're going to be a part of a space, you are not just consuming, but that you're also being an active participatory member of the space, so that that helps you to build relationships with people, and it helps you to feel like you're actually a member of the space rather than just, you know, it being another thing that's popping up on your social media.
Adam, Josie?
So you're saying advice for people that are just joining the group, or for
Who choose to participate in general?
Yeah, I think I would just say proceed with caution, because it looks different for different people. And I think there's some people, especially in a group of 30,000 plus members, in this case, certain people will really enjoy it. Some people will really have problems with it.
Mm-hmm.
And consider your own like mental well-being as part of your decision-making process. And then consider places where, if you want to challenge the group, where you can, to kind of push things forward. But I think like that's probably about as far as I would go in terms of advice for the group.
I think my piece of advice would go beyond the group, but I think also applies, is not just to consume, but to create value, create conversation, be a problem solver. Because we have a lot of consumers, not just in student affairs, but in our entire society. And maybe that could inspire you to create your own group that's going to fulfill a niche that you see, or to create a podcast. And that's where I'm seeing more Facebook groups being created that are filling these needs based upon niches. If it's there's a new one about like side hustlers of higher ed and podcasters of higher education. Like you can find, and maybe that brings way more value to your life than this big group. So you can figure out what your needs are and get creating.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I want to do a higher ed live episode on the side hustle, but I feel like the word hustle has such a derogatory connotation to it. We need to find another word for hustle.
Grind?
Grind?
I don't know.
All right, so the final question is to ask each of you if you can share a few resources, whether it be websites, books, conferences, newsletters, that the audience can dig into to learn more about and explore some of the topics that we covered today. Let's go in reverse order. Josie, you want to start us?
Sure. Well, just again, like, and I'm getting feedback. I don't know if I'm being high maintenance, but instead of like a resource, again, because how quickly these things get outdated, I would suggest for you to find people to look to, both in lurking and learning from them. And I'm sorry, that's my dogs that are just saying hello. So watch how they use Twitter if they're on Facebook, and you attain to be their role someday, or even for them to be your mentor. Pay attention to their behaviors and be inspired and learn from them. And heck, maybe even reach out to them and ask for a phone call. That has been some of my most powerful networking, which I'm pretty sure all of you here, I did that to you at some time. I jumped into a DM and was like, hey, you want a phone call? I swear I'm not weird. But our field is made up of all these professionals that we'll take those types of calls. So that's my resource. Seek out people and maybe not so much paper, and we can grow a lot from there.
Okay. All right, Adam, you're up next.
I would just say that higher ed and student affairs in particular sometimes can lean towards being insular. And so it's kind of the same people talking to the same people a lot of the time. And so I would suggest looking beyond the field for advice on, like when you're thinking about how to use digital communities, engaging with communities that don't necessarily work directly with your space at times too, because I think that there's a lot of lessons and wisdom to be drawn from other fields. And I think thinking with an interdisciplinary spirit about your own practice is really important, and helps kind of make the campus have more of a diversity of thought, and brings a lot of new ideas to the table that might help make you a better professional and might make your institution better.
Love it. All right, Paul, you're up.
Okay, I'm going to be a nerd and say that if you're going to be interested in this topic and you actually want to be a researcher, this is maybe for my faculty colleagues, we need much more work. People need to be exposed to how to do this research, right? It's not being taught in doc programs very much. So I would point you to things like the SAGE manual of digital research methods, or doing qualitative research in online learning spaces, or some of these types of things, and read some of the tech journals, like get outside. That, unfortunately, I'll make a critique of the field here. Unfortunately, some of our journals in higher education are just not embracing this research. It gets rejected a lot when you submit it because they don't understand it. So until we're able to break that into the higher ed journals, you have to go to some of these outside journals. And so I would encourage folks to do that to get a better understanding. Like Adam said earlier, we found hundreds of articles from other professions that deal with this topic. And so you can learn a lot just by doing some of that lit review outside of the field of higher ed journals.
All right, Laura, last word goes to you.
I was just gonna say, study problems, not things again. And we need more practitioners actually doing some of this research, because I think many of you are involved in these communities and you're very active and you give back a lot to the field and the profession of practice. So even if you don't think you can research, you probably can, and we'd love to collaborate with you. And I think there's other people that are doing great work out there, like Adam said, in other fields and other domains. They're very similar and like-minded to you. And if you don't know who, maybe we could get you connected to them. And because I think we need more people involved in finding evidence to some of the work we do, because that's how we share our knowledge, and that's how, honestly, we're going to prove our worth and why we do these things that are sometimes considered outside of the regular profession. Well, this is the field, and this is the direction we're heading. So we'd love you to be part of that research and practice.
Yes.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank all of you. It is always a pleasure to hang out with you, both in real person and digitally. I look forward to reading all of your upcoming research and all the books I know many of you are working on. Thanks, as always, to our program sponsors. Keith Edwards will be filling in for Heather Shea next month, and we'll be back on June 13th to discuss Pedagogy Beyond the Classroom with Jane Freed, Vijay Kanagala, and Ruth Harper. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Doody. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.